This is chapter 6 from the book by James B. Jordan, Through New Eyes, Developing a Biblical View of the World. Chapter 6, and it's titled Rocks, Gold, and Gems. I have seldom lived in large cities, and thus have not often been privileged to visit museums. I recall my frustration on one occasion, however, when I visited an exhibit of precious gemstones. I did not get to see very much of it because the room was so crowded with people peering through the glass at these pieces of rock. In another room, there was an exhibit of rocks that glowed with peculiar colors under ultraviolet light. One had to stand in front of a window to see these, and again it was difficult to work one's way through the crowd. I don't suppose my experience is particularly unique or worth recounting, except that it is a telling example of the fact that people, for some reason, like to look at certain pieces of rock. The Bible has a lot to say about stones and rocks, and more than we might think about gold, gems, and precious stones. These are given us as emblems of God and His glory, and since men are made in God's image, they also speak of men. The best way to begin a study of this is to look at God, the rock of our salvation. The key passage to begin with is Deuteronomy 32, which might be called the Song of the Rock, though it is usually called the Song of Moses because Moses wrote it. You remember that when Israel came out of Egypt, the Israelites were thirsty, and God told Moses to strike the rock to give them water. God's cloud sat upon the rock, and when Moses brought the rod of judgment down on the rock, it passed through the cloud. In this way, God told the people that He would take upon Himself the judgment that they deserved, and that when He did so, living water would be given to them. Thus God told them that He was their rock, and that He would give them water. And naturally, when God the rock made covenant with Israel, He wrote it in stone. For years after that, Israel wandered in the wilderness. This wilderness was full of rocks and huge stones. They were all around Israel as she traveled, and they surrounded the people as they gathered to Moses to hear the song of Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32, verses 3 and 4. I proclaim the name of the Lord. Ascribe greatness to our God, the rock. His work is perfect. For all His ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice. Righteous and upright is He. In other words, God is constant and unfailing to His people. And like a rock, God does not change from day to day, from time to time. God does not change. He's like a rock. Deuteronomy 32, verses 15 through 16 and verse 18. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and scorned the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. You neglected the rock who begot you, and forgot the God who gave you birth. Moses told them that God would forsake them if they turned to other rocks. Deuteronomy 32, verses 30 and 31. How could one chase 1,000, and two put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them, and the Lord had given them up? Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. The gods of other nations are like little rocks, without much to them. Israel would be foolish to forsake the true rock, because in time, God would destroy these pebbles. Deuteronomy 32:37, and He will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge? When Samuel was born, his mother Hannah celebrated God as her rock. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides thee. Nor is there any rock like our God. 1 Samuel 2:2. David also celebrated God as his rock. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is a rock besides our God? The Lord lives and blessed me, my rock, and exalted be God, the rock of my salvation. And the Psalter abounds in references to God as our rock. And this is some verses out of numerous chapters of the Psalms. To make it quick for time's sake, I'll just read them. To thee, O Lord, I call, my rock. Do not be deaf to me. Incline thy ear to me. Rescue me quickly. Be thou to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me, for thou art my rock and my fortress. I will say to God, my rock, why hast thou forgotten me? Why do I go mourning? O come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. And Isaiah also delights to call God the rock of Israel. Isaiah 17:10. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Trust in the Lord forever, for in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. And we can summarize what the Bible says about God as our rock by taking note of 5 things. First, the rock points to strength. A rock is hard, a rock is firm, and if it is a large rock, it is pretty much unbreakable. Second, God presents himself as a rock to hide in, a fortress. God put Moses in the cleft of a rock to protect him from God's consuming glory. And since this rock is said to be a place next to me, commentators have often associated it with Jesus Christ, our protector. And third, God as rock points to judgment. If a large rock falls on you, you're crushed. And just such a judging rock is God. Jesus called himself the stone which the builders rejected, and said that everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. But on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. Falling on a stone and being broken is an image of salvation, but the stone falling on you is an image of judgment. Also along these lines, we remember that the prescribed method of execution in the Bible was by stoning. Daniel's vision of world history saw the kingdom of Christ as a stone cut without hands that would strike and shatter the kingdoms of the world. In an ambiguous passage, the saints are said to rejoice when they dashed the children of Babylon against the rock. But in the light of Luke 20:18, does this point to destruction or salvation? Since the church has always seen the waters of baptism as waters of judgment unto salvation, baptismal fonts have often been made of stone. Fourth, God as our rock is the foundation of his house, his kingdom. The wise man builds his house on his rock. Christ is the chief cornerstone, and we are all living stones. Fifth, a mighty rock gives shade, a picture of God's provision and protection. We have seen that God's glory cloud gave shade to Israel in the wilderness. A large shade-giving rock is like this cloud in shape and function. God's people, as his images, are also like rocks. God is the great rock, and we are the little rocks. We have already mentioned how we as living stones are built on God as our foundation, his living temple. Isaiah 32:2 speaks of how Christians minister to one another as rocks. Each will be like a refuge from the wind and a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry country, like the shade of a huge rock in a parched land. The best known passage that speaks of this is Matthew 16:18. And I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The name Peter means rock, but it is not the same as the word for the rock upon which Christ builds his church. That second word means great rock or bedrock, foundation. Thus, Peter is a little rock, a chip off the true rock, as it were. The first stones mentioned in the Bible are those of Havilah, a land downstream from Eden. Genesis 2:10 through 12. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pison. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. The bdellium and the onyx stone are there. Eden is the land of food, and the outlying lands are lands of other raw materials. The Bible conceives a commerce between these lands, so that those of Adam's descendants who lived in Eden would have to engage in trade with those who had moved downstream to Havilah. In this way, precious stones would be brought from Havilah back to Eden to adorn the sanctuary. When Israel came out of Egypt, she sojourned in the land of Havilah, while the tabernacle and the high priest's garments were made. Here in this land of rocks were made many items of gold and onyx. Indeed, the only reference in the Bible to the onyx stone outside of Genesis chapter 2 is in connection with the high priest's garments. The shoulder stones of the ephod were made of onyx and had the names of the 12 tribes put on them. No one knows that bdellium is supposed to be. The only other reference to it in the Bible is Numbers 11:17, where we are told that manna was the color of the bdellium. And the bdellium is an odious resin from a tree in Asian and African lands. Since manna was white, the bdellium was also white. Now notice that Israel only ate manna while she was in the wilderness of Havilah, the land of bdellium. Now gold is much more familiar to us. More than any other metals, gold and silver show forth the glory of God. In every time, in every clime, in every land and nation, gold and silver come to be regarded as valuable. There are 2 points to be made concerning this. First of all, gold and silver, and especially gold, are heavy. The Hebrew word for glory literally means heavy. A few years ago, in American slang, anything that was impressive was heavy, and this reflects a sound linguistic instinct. Part of the attractiveness and glory of gold, then, lies in its weight. Second, not only is gold heavy, it is also radiant and shining. God's glory appears as a flaming fire and a burning furnace, and gold, more than any other mineral, ties into the human tendency to appreciate this glory. The walls of the tabernacle and temple were both lined with gold, creating a golden glory environment all around. Similarly, the fiery tree or lampstand in the tabernacle, an abiding replica of the burning bush, was made of gold, as were many other items. Let us turn our attention now to precious stones. They are, after all, the glory stones. We enjoy looking at them in coffee table books. We make jewelry out of them. We pay high prices for them, not because they are rare, but because they are beautiful and thus highly prized. In Ezekiel 28:13 and 14, we find a description of the king of Tyre. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise and the emerald, and the gold, the workmanship of your settings and sockets, was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you. You were on a holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. Now, some commentators have suggested that the king of Tyre is Lucifer because he's called a cherub, and others have pointed to Adam because of Eden. Now, in light of the context, however, we should see this king of Tyre as the high priest of Israel. Israel was the true head of the nations, spiritually speaking. Now, Tyre had been allied spiritually with Israel in David's time, and thus had recognized the high priest as her ultimate earthly spiritual leader. Indeed, Tyre had helped build the temple. We went over this back in first couple chapters of Amos. Tyre, living downstream from Eden in Havilah, assisted Solomon in getting gold for the temple. Tyre had provided these Havilah raw materials in exchange for table provisions from the Edenic floodland of Israel, thus providing a snapshot of how the priestly nation was to interact with other converted nations. Now, however, Tyre had broken faith, and thus the Lord made a long prophecy against her and her prince. This apostasy did not occur in a vacuum, however, as Ezekiel had already shown at length. It was Israel's apostasy that had misled the nations. It was the high priest, the spiritual king of Tyre, whose sin had ultimately caused the prince of Tyre to go astray. Now, with this background, we can understand better the imagery of Ezekiel 28:13 through 14. Eden, the garden of God, is the land of Israel, and most particularly Jerusalem. The covering of precious stones is the breastpiece of the high priest, described in Exodus 28:15 through 21. The high priest was the cherubic guardian of the temple, and his failure to maintain God's holiness had led both Israel and her ally Tyre into sin. The holy mountain is Mount Moriah, the temple site. And we notice that the gemstones are called stones of fire. This is because these stones house fire. Now, if you had a diamond ring, hold it up. Notice the fire within. Each of these stones is a tiny image of God's glory, His fire. The high priest, whose chest was covered with such fiery stones, thus had his own personal glory cloud, an image of God's. It is because gemstones so pointedly reflect God's glory that we regard them as beautiful. It is written on the heart of man to appreciate glory, and it takes a great act of the will to pervert this attraction. We delight in a beautiful sunset, in the sound of rushing water, and in gemstones, because each of these images the very glory of God Himself. Fallen man may not want God, but he does want God's glory. Not only can we see gemstones as frozen pieces of glory, but we can also see them as frozen pieces of the rainbow. The rainbow is, of course, a manifestation of glory, being made of light and all colors. It appears in the heavens like the glory of God, and the Bible shows it encircling God's throne. The rainbow first appears in the familiar passage in Genesis 9:12 through 16, where God put His war bow in the sky and said, "When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it, to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." Genesis 9:16. Now, it is nice for us to look at rainbows and be reminded that God will never again destroy the earth with a flood. But it is more important for God to be reminded when He sees it. Now, of course, God does not need to be reminded of anything, but He has chosen to do things this way for our comfort. But does God only see this rainbow when it rains? No, because God is always surrounded by His glory cloud, and thus He always sees the rainbow. When Ezekiel saw God's glory chariot, he wrote that as the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. Ezekiel 1:28. Now similarly, when John stood before God's throne, he saw that there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. Now John compared the rainbow to a gemstone. Now finally, in Revelation 10:1, John had a vision of the exalted Christ and described Him as another strong angel coming down out of heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow was upon His head, and His face was like the sun, and His legs like pillars of fire. The rainbow around His head means that Christ looks through it to see the world, always reminded of the Noahic covenant. The rainbow encircles God's throne, but so too do the gemstones. In Revelation 21, we have a vision of the New Jerusalem, the city built around God's throne. Jerusalem is an architectural replica of God's glory home. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was jasper, the second, sapphire, the third, chalcedony, the fourth, emerald, the fifth, sardonyx, the sixth, sardius, the seventh, chrysolite, the eighth, beryl, the ninth, topaz, the 10th, chrysoprase, the 11th, jacinth, the 12th, amethyst. Those stones are hard to pronounce. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each one of the gates with a single pearl. In other words, the city was encircled with gemstones, stones of the land for Israel, and pearls were from the sea for Gentiles. These foundation stones have already been associated with the names of the apostles, just as the high priest's 12 stones had written on them the 12 tribes of Israel. Thus, these stones represent people. We are God's house of gemstones. The righteous people in the church are likened to gemstones by Paul in his famous temple message in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 through 13. According to the grace of God which was given to me, as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is a building upon it. But let each man be careful how he builds upon it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man builds upon the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it was revealed with fire. Now Paul is writing to pastors who will continue building the house whose foundation he has already laid. Paul says that the church is built up of saints who are like gold and silver and gemstones, but also includes Satan's agents who were like wood, hay, and stubble. God puts wicked into the church so that they may catch on fire and turn the church into a refining furnace to purify His people. God does not want ugly brown stones adorning the walls of His house. He wants lovely, pure stones, glorious stones of fire, chips of frozen rainbow. He wants a people of peace, a rainbow people who respect the Noahic covenant and thus love His world and will not destroy it. Christians are a rainbow war bow of the Prince of Peace, bringing peace to the world of humanity in the gospel. But also, the fact that the high priest carried the gemstone on his heart means that we as God's gemstones are always next to the heart of Christ. We may feel like ugly gray rocks that have been cast aside, but we know in faith that God carries us on his heart, and we are of infinite value to him. So that concludes the 6th chapter of the book Through New Eyes by James Jordan. Chapter 6, Rocks, Gold, and Gems. Till next time.